The world smelled like cold metal and old blood. Above the cage, lights buzzed against the heavy silence, flickering weakly in the damp air. The walls sweated with condensation, dripping slow tears onto the rusted grates below. Every breath was a bite of iron and fear. The Zareth beast prowled at the far end of the enclosure. Its massive body moved with a lazy menace, claws scraping long, aching notes from the floor. Its skin was armored in patches of black and dull silver, shifting with each flex of its muscles. Eyes burned like twin coals under its ridged brow. It had killed everything that entered here. Everything. Until now. The gate creaked open, and a man stepped through. No armor, no weapon, just boots grinding into the blood-stained floor and a simple jacket too thin for the cold. Dane Riven. They said his name like a curse in the upper towers, a whisper of failure the masters refused to acknowledge. But here in the broken heart of a facility Cora, 9 names meant nothing. Only survival did. He walked to the center of the cage and stopped. No stance, no threat, just presence. The Zareth beast stilled, its head tilted slightly. The air between them thickened as if the world itself held its breath. Up in the observation deck, scientists and guards leaned forward, waiting for the scream, the snap of bone, the splash of blood. But Dane did not flinch. He did not blink. He simply stood and waited. The beast took a step closer. A low rumble vibrated in its chest. Warning. Promise. It circled him once, slow muscles coiling under skin, stretched taut with old scars. Dane turned with it, never showing his back, never lowering his gaze. The handlers whispered into comms, "Get ready, containment teams poised behind blast shields, weapons armed with sedatives, powerful enough to drop an armored crawler." But nothing happened. The beast stopped in front of Dane, breath steaming the air between them. Its claws twitched, its jaws flexed, and then it lowered its head, slow, deliberate, a gesture older than words, older than fear, submission, not forced, not broken, given. Gasps hissed across the observation deck. Monitors beeped warning signals they did not know how to interpret. The lead handler shouted into the comms, "Contain it. Take him down. Take them both down." But no one moved. Because for the first time in the history of the cages, something stronger than fear filled the air. Recognition, respect. Dane Riven stood alone in the heart of the storm, and the monster chose to kneel, not to the facility, not to the masters, to him, only him. The cage door hissed shut behind him. The Zareth beast remained where it was, crouched low, watching Dane with slow, blinking eyes that glowed like fading stars. Up in the control room, no one spoke. No orders shouted, no sirens blaring. Only the low, almost desperate clatter of keyboards as technicians tried to explain the impossible. This was not in the models, not in the training. The monster should have torn him apart. Instead, it breathed in rhythm with him. Dane moved first, not fast, not aggressive, just a slow turn, a glance toward the far side of the enclosure where another cage had joined this one. A shadow stirred behind the bars. Something else forgotten. Something else deemed too dangerous or too broken to be worth fixing. It watched him, silent, suspicious, waiting. Dane stepped closer to the barrier. The handlers murmured. Ready tranquilizers, ready restraints. But he only stood there, hands loose at his sides. No threats, no bargains, just a quiet presence. The shadow pressed against the bars. A low sound rumbled from its throat. Not a snarl, not a growl. Something almost like a question. Behind the thick observation glass, Dr. Vea Solis watched with a clenched jaw. She had studied behavior modification protocols for years. She had authored reports on trauma conditioning. None of it made sense now. This was not dominance. This was not obedience. This was something else. Connection. Without force. Without command. It terrified her more than any outbreak alert ever could. Because if one human could undo all their controls simply by standing, what did that say about the empire they had built below? Dane tilted his head. The creature in the adjacent cage copied the motion, mirrored it, its shoulders lowered, its breathing slowed. Another small bow. A second fracture in the system. In the deeper cages, sensors flickered to life. Other prisoners' forgotten experiments, old soldiers' things that should have been dead or mad sat up. Stood. Listened. Because sometimes the loudest sound is not a roar, not a command, not a scream. Sometimes it is the simple refusal to kneel, and that refusal was spreading. Dane turned back to the Zareth beast. He knelt, not in submission, not in fear, in invitation, in offer. The beast stepped forward, pressed its massive head lightly against his shoulder. A bond formed in that quiet, impossible moment. Not of chains, not of walls, of choice. Up in the control room, a technician whispered, "Sir, what do we do?" The handler in charge stared down at the cage and realized there was no protocol for this. No weapon for this. No cage strong enough for this. Only fear. And fear was already beginning to break. The corridors beyond the main cage block were dark, silent, abandoned long before today. The facility had grown arrogant over the years, believing the oldest cells did not need watching anymore, believing nothing left in them could matter. They had forgotten their own lessons. Now those forgotten ones stirred. Motion sensors flickered awake. Old locks clicked and whined against age and rust. Somewhere deep in the lower levels, a massive paw scraped against reinforced steel. A set of yellow eyes blinked open in the gloom. Breath misted in the frigid air. The Zareth beast lifted its head from Dane's shoulder and let out a low sound. Not a roar, not a warning, a call, carried on frequencies too low for most ears. But every creature that had been chained here, every life deemed too broken to save, heard it and answered. Up in the control room, alarms flashed. Unauthorized movement detected. Sector 12, Sector 4, Sector 9. The technicians scrambled, shouting into headsets, punching override codes into consoles that suddenly did not listen. The handlers barked orders that fell into static. In one security feed after another, cages began to open. Not because someone hacked them, not because systems failed, because locks keyed to life signs, to brainwaves, to thought patterns found themselves tricked by something older than programming. Choice. The Dr. Vea Solis stood frozen before the main screen. She watched as the facility she thought she understood unraveled. She watched as beings who should have been mindless moved with purpose, with coordination. Not mindless escape, not wild rebellion, but gathering, converging, toward one point, toward him, toward Dane Riven. He did not speak. He did not gesture. He simply stood in the center of the cage, calm as a stone in a rising tide. The Zareth beast pressed close beside him. Other shapes began to appear in the shadows of the enclosure. Not enemies, not prisoners, allies. A living tide of the forgotten answering the call they had been waiting for all along. Not to destroy, to follow. The first containment teams entered the block, weapons drawn, armor gleaming. They expected chaos. They expected madness. Instead, they found silence. And in that silence, they found fear. Because the ones they had broken, the ones they had buried, were standing together. Not raging, not screaming, waiting. And behind them at their heart stood the man who had done what no weapon ever could. Made them believe. The lead enforcer hesitated, raised his pulse rifle, issued a final warning. Dane met his eyes, said nothing. And slowly, one by one, the soldiers lowered their weapons. Not from orders, not from threats, from understanding, from memory, that some things cannot be commanded, only followed. Vea turned away from the screens, her heart hammering against her ribs, not from fear, from awe. Because for the first time in all her years behind glass and protocol, she realized they had not built a prison. They had built a waiting place, and Dane Riven had just woken it up. The sirens had fallen silent. The facility, once a hive of sharp orders and mechanical clicks, now breathed in long, broken gasps. Every hallway seemed stretched too wide, every shadow too deep. Vea Solis moved through the upper corridors, alone. Her boots echoed against the steel floors. She kept one hand on the sidearm at her belt, though she knew it would be useless if the creatures chose to turn against her. But they did not. They ignored her. They moved past her like mist curling around a forgotten stone, following another, following him. She reached the observation block, the one the facility had sealed years ago after a failed experiment. The doors stood ajar now. The emergency lights flickered. Something inside called to her curiosity, to her dread. She stepped through. The walls were covered in old records, half-burned data slates, cracked screens still looping error codes. And there, scrawled across the farthest wall, was the symbol. Not fresh, not new, etched deep into the metal with something that had torn through steel like paper. A circle broken by a single jagged line. At first glance it meant nothing, just a scar. But Vea knew better, because she had seen this mark once before. Long ago, buried deep in warning files classified above her clearance. Files left behind by the first settlers of the outer colonies. Files that spoke of a presence they could not kill, a presence they could not bend. They had called it by many names: ghost, traitor, predator. But the message had always been clear. If you see the mark, run. Vea touched the cold metal with her fingertips. It hummed faintly under her skin. Alive. Older than the facility. Older than the empire that thought it ruled the stars. In the dark, a low whisper crawled through the vents. Not words, not commands. A memory. They came here believing they had built a cage. They built a crucible instead. They came here believing they could tame monsters. But monsters had nothing to teach him, because he was never made to kneel, only to remember. Vea staggered back from the wall. Her mind raced. Dane Riven was not a lucky prisoner, not a survivor who stumbled into defiance. He was a carrier, a spark carried across dead worlds. Waiting, waiting for the right moment, waiting for the right audience. And now the audience was here. The beasts, the broken, the forgotten. And they listened. Because in a universe addicted to control, nothing is more terrifying than a man who teaches others how to choose. In the distance, deep under the foundation stones of the facility, the sound of steel tearing echoed up through the floors. The old gates, the final locks breaking apart, the true exodus beginning, and Dane silent, unshakable, already leading the way. Vea gripped the edge of the ruined wall. The mark burned against her palm, a choice pressed against her ribs. Stay behind the walls or follow the man who did not need walls at all. And in that moment, she realized her choice had already been made. The lower levels groaned under the strain. Bulkheads buckled. Gates bent inward as if something inside them had simply decided they were no longer real. Sirens wailed once, shrill and desperate, then fell silent. The facility was coming apart, not from bombs, not from rebellion, from the simplest weapon no one had prepared for. Refusal. Dane Riven walked through the heart of the ruins. The Zareth beast padded at his side. Other figures moved with him, tall, scarred creatures who had once been weapons. Bent, broken souls who had once been kings in forgotten wars. Feral things that the masters had dismissed as failures. All walking now, all awake, none looking back. Containment teams tried to form walls, raised pulse shields, deployed sonic suppressors. But the march never slowed. The forgotten ones moved like a tide that had finally remembered its course. One soldier shouted orders through a cracked comm unit. Stand your ground, stand your ground. But when Dane passed, he lowered his weapon. Not from fear, from recognition. Because deep inside, some part of him remembered too. What it felt like to be something more than a cog. What it felt like to be human. Above them, Vea Solis watched from a shattered balcony. She gripped the rail with numb fingers. She had made her choice. She had stepped away from the orders barked through the facility speakers. Stepped toward the man who needed no orders. And now she understood. Dane was not leading an army. He was waking a memory, old and stubborn and full of teeth. The central control tower loomed ahead. Last stronghold of the masters. The ones who still believed they held the leash. Dane paused at the base of the stairs. He looked up. Not with hatred, not with rage, just with certainty. Then he climbed, slow, relentless. The Zareth beast followed. The others spread out, surrounding the tower like shadows sharpening their teeth. Inside the tower, the masters barked into comms, activated security drones, prepared last fail-safe protocols. But it was already too late. No lockdown code can stop something that was never built into the system. No override password can erase a will never programmed. Dane reached the top of the stairs. The door to the control room hissed open. He stepped inside. The masters lifted their weapons, hesitated, because what stood before them was not an army, not a monster, just a man, breathing, standing, choosing, and that more than any weapon broke them. The masters dropped their guns, one by one. No commands, no demands. Just the quiet collapse of a world that had forgotten what freedom sounded like. It sounded like footsteps across broken tiles. It sounded like doors swinging wide. It sounded like a cage shattering from the inside. Dane turned, walked back into the open air. The broken ones followed, not because they had to, because they chose to. Behind them, the tower flickered, died. The lights failed. The facility fell silent, not destroyed, emptied, freed. Vea stepped into his path, eyes shining, breath catching. "Where do we go now?" she asked. Dane smiled. "Software unshakable. Anywhere, everywhere, as long as it is forward." The open air tasted wrong, too sharp, too wide. After months trapped under concrete and steel, the sky seemed unnatural, like a wound peeled across the heavens. The ruins of the facility smoked behind them. The forgotten ones moved in restless waves, feeling the strangeness of freedom cling to their skin like static. Not sure yet if they were supposed to breathe or run. Ahead, across the broken field, armored transports crawled over the hills. The outside world had not been sleeping. It had watched. It had waited. And now it moved. Gleaming metal beasts bristling with weapons marching under the banners of containment and control. Soldiers poured from the sides, helmets gleaming, rifles raised, lines formed with mechanical precision. Orders barked through loudspeakers. "Lay down, submit, you will be treated fairly." Neil Vea stood beside Dane. The cold wind tugged at her jacket, at her resolve. She glanced at him. He had no weapon in hand, no shield, only his eyes. Steady, clear, alive. The creatures behind them shifted. The Zareth beast growled low, claws flexing. The others stirred, old instincts clawing up from broken memories. Fight or flight. Run or kneel. The oldest choices in the universe. Dane stepped forward. One step. Two. No armor, no banners, no shouted slogans. Just him. And that was enough. The soldiers hesitated. Guns shook. Hands trembled. Because somewhere deep inside, beneath the training, beneath the conditioning, a whisper stirred. Memory. The ancient truth that no one rules forever, unless those they claim to rule allow it. The lead officer raised his weapon, voice shaking. "This is your only warning. Lay down now." Dane kept walking. Vea followed. The others followed. Not charging, not roaring, just walking, choosing, breathing. The first soldier dropped his rifle. It hit the ground with a sound like a thunderclap in the stunned silence. Another stepped back. Another tore off his helmet. The line broke. Because fear is contagious, but so is courage. The transports turned. The armored beasts hesitated. Because machines obey commands, but people remember. Vea exhaled, a long breath she had been holding for years. She turned to Dane. "What now?" he smiled. "Now we find out how far we can go before someone else tries to build a cage. And when they do, we break that one too." The broken, the forgotten, the ones once caged moved into the world like a tide finally finding its shore. Not seeking revenge, not seeking conquest, simply seeking to live. Without kneeling, without forgetting, without fear. Far behind them, the facility crumbled into dust, taking with it the lie that some things must always be controlled, and leaving behind the quiet thunder of footsteps moving forward. The ruins smoldered behind them. Ash curled into the sky like fingers of smoke trying to pull them back, trying to remind them what they had left behind. But Dane Riven did not look back. Neither did Vea Solis. Neither did the others, the broken ones, the forgotten ones, the ones who had been called monsters now walking in open air for the first time in years, maybe the first time ever. The land beyond the facility stretched wide. Ruined highways, collapsed towers, fields overgrown and starved of care. A world that had tried to survive without them and was failing anyway. Because cages do not just hold prisoners. They hold back what the world most needs to change. And when those cages fall, something more than rebellion wakes up. Something harder to name. Something impossible to chain again. Dane led them through the wasteland not as a commander, not as a savior, but as a point of gravity, a silent pull towards something none of them could fully see yet, but all of them could feel. From the broken cities, from the Edgeworld stations, from the fractured mining colonies where silence had reigned too long, whispers traveled faster than drones. The facility has fallen, the beasts walk free. The human who knelt to no one leads them. Some laughed, some trembled. Most did not know what to believe. But belief was no longer necessary. Movement had begun. And movement is always louder than rumor. At night they built small fires. The Zareth beast curled near Dane's side like a living mountain, breathing slow. The others slept fitfully, dreaming dreams that were finally their own. Vea sat beside Dane wrapped in a worn jacket, staring into the flicker of flame. "Do you think they will come after us?" she asked. Dane tossed another branch into the fire. "They will. They always do." And when they do, Vea prompted. Dane smiled sharp and soft at once. "Then we teach them that cages were never strong enough to hold what remembers how to choose." The stars above wheeled slowly across the black, uncaring, unstoppable. Witness to a world trembling at the edge of something it had long forgotten. Hope wild and stubborn and born in ashes. Hope that smelled like blood and frost and freedom. Hope that had teeth. Somewhere far away in a conference room lined with polished glass, powerful people gathered, arguing, shouting afraid. Because they could control wars. They could manipulate markets. But they had no defense against a memory walking against a choice. Breathing against a man who had looked into the heart of a beast and seen himself. And out here among the ruins and the embers, Dane Riven did not need their approval. He had already won the only battle that ever mattered. The right to walk forward without asking permission. The morning broke without ceremony. No anthems rose with the sun. No flags waved. Just the slow creeping of light across ruined concrete and twisted fields, touching the backs of those who walked forward without needing to be told they could. Dane Riven stood at the edge of a crumbling overpass. The Zareth beast sat beside him, its massive head tilted to catch the wind. Vea Solis leaned against the broken guardrail, arms crossed, eyes on the distant horizon. Beyond them, the world stretched open waiting. There would be no parades, no declarations, no thrones reclaimed. That was never the point. This was not about overthrowing a tyrant. It was about tearing the fear out of the ground root and all so nothing could grow in its place again. It was about reminding the forgotten that they had been something before the cages and they could be something after. Vea spoke first. "So what now?" Dane smiled, the same quiet curve of lips that had undone an empire built on silence. Now he said, "We build something no one knows how to burn down." He pulled a piece of metal from his coat pocket, small, charged sharp along one edge. He knelt at the base of the overpass, pressed the metal into the concrete, carved slowly, steadily until the mark was there. A circle broken by a jagged line. The mark of those who chose to remember. The mark of those who chose to stand. No speeches, no promises. Just a simple truth etched into stone, waiting for the ones who would come after. The ones who would find it and understand without ever needing to be told. "You are not alone. You were never supposed to be." Dane rose, turned away from the mark. The Zareth beast huffed a breath, rising to its feet. Vea fell in step beside him, and together they walked into the dust and the sun, leaving behind nothing the old world could use, and everything the new one needed to begin. Far behind them, wind whispered through the broken city, caught the fresh mark on the concrete, and carried it onward. Not a roar, not a command, just a memory soft and stubborn as breath. And if you are still here, if you have walked with us through the cages, through the ashes, through the dust, then maybe you already know. The strongest predator is not the one who hunts, but the one who refuses to kneel. The real revolution is not in the fire we set, but in the footsteps we leave behind. Tell us, have you ever stood when it was easier to kneel? Have you ever walked when the world told you to crawl? Share your story in the comments, Because here at HFY Obsession, we believe that every step forward, no matter how quiet, is the beginning of something the world can never chain again. And we are walking right beside you, always.